Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good to see you, Otto Laske. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is the second part of a series around the question of scaffolding dialectical thinking or scaffolding meta-systemic thinking. In the first part, we have been talking to John Stewart, and now this is the second part with you, Otto Laske. There will be a third salon where John Stewart and Otto Laske will be in dialogue. I'm really happy that the two of you, John and Otto, that you are doing this, and the stage is yours. Otto Laske, over to you.
This is my topic, the evolutionary past and future of the thinker. Musings about the evolution of thought in the context of planetary being. I will set forth a series of hypotheses that draw conclusions from a French thinker's theory of evolution, whose name is Gilbert Simondon, and from CDF. And I will be searching for answers to the question of what might be the consequences of two transitions from a purely psychic to a reflexive mind system, which you will hear about, and the transition within the reflexive system from purely logical to meta-systemic or dialectical thinking. And here is my proposition. I think before we deal with the topic of human thinking, we need to clarify what ontologically is a thinker as an integral part of human being. And when making evolutionary claims regarding human being, we need to spell out what we mean by evolution and set evolution apart from development, which is an integral part of evolution, but we don't know in what way. This will be in two parts. The first part will be the evolutionary past and future of the thinker, and the second part, that is somewhat briefer, will be on meta-systemic thinking itself. We owe it to John Stewart, who is present, wonderful, that we can begin to ask questions about cognitive development in relation to human evolution, not just development. Those questions are not obvious and easy to formulate, as his work shows. And I think to operate safely in this highly complex context, we need to approach human evolution, in contrast to development, in the broadest possible way, as that of human agents that are ingredients of the evolution of planetary being. In this endeavor, we cannot split the cognitive from the social-emotional and its psychic base, which are embedded in a physical biological system. That means we need to frame cognitive development as a substream of a much larger process. I think only then can we hope to arrive with some cogency at a correct formulation of even pragmatic questions of how to scaffold meta-systemic thinking. There are two approaches to understanding evolution that I am aware of. One is what I call the Anglo-American positivistic approach, and the other is the French philosophical approach that comes from Merleau-Ponty, Simondon, Derrida, and Stigler. The first approach, here's how they differ. The first approach focuses on scientific notions of consciousness and its brain and formulates hypotheses accordingly. And to my understanding, it does not question the conventional Kantian notion of individual as the carrier of mind. The second, French tradition, is critical of treating human being as a substance with evolutionary and developmental properties, for the reason that it wants to understand how the physical brain opened a path for mind to emerge from within a physical biological system, and why this system at some point had no choice but to extend itself into the psychic, and as I will hypothesize further, into a reflexive system. I'm speaking about 4 systems, which I will show you in a few seconds. In this tradition, Gimondon offers a notion of evolution that critiques the Kantian notion of individual, and thus also of thinker. He is putting the emphasis on individuation of reality, not just human, proposing that evolution, which he calls devenir, leads from a pre-individual to a trans-individual phase of being, such that the individual, the human individual, which he refers to as a subject, which I will explain, is the bridge between the pre-individual and the trans-individual dimension of reality. Here is a diagram by which I'm trying to show you what this implies. The figure depicts human evolution, as you can see, pre-individual reality, which is not only pre-individual, but not individuated. There are no individuals in this reality. So that's why it's called pre-individual. Pre-individual reality is a set of deep potentials that reside in tense metastable fields unfolding in real time, setting forth progressive individualization. And so what you see here, the human, I'm discussing the physical, the human case of evolution. So that what you see here, the physical system or being, extended itself into a biological system, and together they extended themselves in what Simondon calls a psychic system, psychic taken in the Greek sense of psyche. And my addition is here this, that I think, if I understand Simondon correctly, that he failed to spell out what I call a reflexive system. These together make up the individual mind. Now, as these systems evolve, one after the other, they are all of them in a trans-individual reality, or you could say they are on their way to a trans-individual reality, which is no longer focused on the individual mind, but is focused on the collective, which I call social being. And that is what I'm going to detail as I go further. So we are talking about evolution out of a pre-individual reality that individualizes itself into these human subsystems, some of them forming the human mind, the individual mind, which extends itself based on reflexive being into the trans-individual reality. That means that the way I approach cognitive development, especially the transition from logical to metasystemic or dialectical thinking, is to ask does metasystemic thinking gets us into a trans-individual reality, or do we remain stuck in the individual mind? Now, this extension of the psychic into a reflexive system of which I spoke as a transition from the pre-individual reality as a set of deep potentials into a trans-individual reality, what can we say about that? If we assume with CDF that the psychic system is a need-press system and that the reflexive system is based on the polarity, if that is the right term, I'm still not sure what this relationship is, of social, emotional, and cognitive development, then what can we say about this extension of the psychic into a reflexive system? If we look at the individual systems composing human being as problem solvers, we can say that there came a point in evolutionary time where they could no longer handle the tension in one of the subsystems and had to move on to the next, which means that one can hypothesize, which I do, that the social emotional component of the reflexive system derives from what in need press is called ideal press, whereas the cognitive system within the reflexive system derives from what in need press is called actual press. And here is why. Ideal press in the need press system, or let's say in a need press system, has to do with the pressure that an individual imposes on him or herself. That's why it's called ideal. It has to do with the values. And so, for instance, if you work in a company and your value system is very different from that of the company, you get into conflicts because you are imposing on yourself your own values, and that leads to ideal press on your ego. And so then you end up with the same question that a social emotional thinking, functioning individual ends up, namely, what should I do? So there is a homogeneity between ideal press in a need press system and social emotional development or functioning. The same is true for actual press, which in a need press system has to do with the external social pressures on the ego exerted by social and physical forces, which ultimately lead to the cognitive question in CDF, what can I do? What can I do about these actual pressures that hinder me from doing my work, that hinder me to develop, and so forth? So while this would occasion many, many more thinking and explanation, I will leave it at what I hypothesized here, that I see the social emotional component of the reflexive systems evolutionarily deriving from ideal press in a need press system and the cognitive system from the actual press. Let me ask, what are the thinkers or a thinker's evolutionary prospects? I told you that Simondon speaks of sujet, subject, and that for him is a broader concept than the individual mind, consisting of these two systems, because sujet or subject comprises all four dimensions. The pre-individual reality as a set of potentials, the psychic system that activates these potentials, the reflexive system which further activates these potentials and leads, according to my hypothesis, into the trans-individual domain. So we can call the sujet, these four dimensions, we can call a thinker. So a thinker has a set of potentials, has a psychic system, has a reflexive ED-CD system, and is on its way to the trans-individual domain, which appears in reality as the social world in the broader sense, or as a collective in the more restricted sense. And I will not have time to go into the minutiae of the relationship of trans-individual system to social and social being and collective. So this leads to interesting question. Present cognitive development theory conceives of a thinker in the Kantian way, or even the Cartesian way, as a substance with developmental attributes. I emphasize substance. Substance here means something thingified. And that is why these wonderful theories of the Kohlberg school can only describe development from the outside, but they cannot explain development as it unfolds. So we hear about the human being as a substance having a social emotional dimension, cognitive dimension, that there are stages, phases, whatever. But that's Fassadenkletterei in terms of Heidegger. We are climbing up a building, we're looking into the windows, but we are not describing the building as it is in process of being built or being lived in. And that's exactly what Simondon wants to change. He wants to explain devenir, becoming itself. He does not want to explain and think it's the wrong way to go, to try to explain how a substance like individual evolves. Now, this is a tall order, as you will realize. So in order to bypass this reductive approach of the Kohlberg school and many, many other schools, psychology, whatever, anthropology, I have conceived of the thinker here as bigger than an individual mind, namely as a sujet that comprises a pre-individual and trans-individual dimension. What does that do? It opens up to questions of where does psychic reality and reflexive reality, including thinking, come from? How do they actually unfold evolutionarily and in real time, so that we don't just describe them from the outside? It gives rise also to a very interesting question, namely, does an individual thinker or a cognitive collective she joins as a subject at a particular evolutionary point carry sufficient pre-individual potential to develop its functioning into a trans-individual functioning? And to what extent does metasystemic thinking lie on the thinker's path toward trans-individuality? That would be my evolutionary core question. Some questions that this leads to, we'll just pick one or two. How exactly, number two, how exactly does human cognitive development towards metasystemic or dialectical thinking extend the psychic into the reflexive system and the reflexive system into a trans-individually functioning one? what is the function and what are the limits of a thought form dialectic in reshaping the human reflexive systems, which also includes social emotional functioning, enabling it to function in a trans-individual domain. And what, in evolutionary terms, is the impact of a reflexive system capable of metasystemic thinking on its associated psychic or need press system? And what are the psychic and reflective resources of human collectives that take the form of social systems that are part of trans-individual reality, and to what extent can social systems be part of trans-individual reality, which I would see as a question about communication beyond Habermas. I will talk about that more. Communication, including scaffolding. I come to part 2. Maybe I should, are there urgent questions? I will now go into dialectical or metasystemic thinking more directly and see it as an individuation of the reflexive system. So I have set the stage for looking at metasystemic thinking ontologically and epistemologically, and have proposed to think of that kind of thinking as a further individuation of a cognitive system, and thus a reflexive system, but also a social emotional system. So the term individuation, you cannot quite translate it simply into differentiation, but it has to do with differentiation. I mean, more strictly speaking, individuation really means creating an individual out of a reality that is not individualized or individualizable. And Simondon distinguishes between individuation and individualization, individuation and individualization. What happens in bringing about systems to emerge? He speaks of individuation, but within systems, there are progressive individualizations also, which you might say have something to do with stages or phases, or even with particular movements in thought, which could completely reorganize a particular cognitive system. And I will go to that. There are two notions of Simondon which I think are useful in the context I have created, namely transduction and metastability. Transduction is a term taken from thermodynamics, which Simondon considers as useful for explaining the evolution tout court, or the evolution of physical, biological, psychic, and social individuals as they emerge from an unindividuated or pre-individual reality, as I showed you initially. This movement is transductive. Transduction is anchored in the correlativity of structure and operation, and is a critique of any thinking in terms of substance. It is about flow, it's about development, it's about evolution, it is about process. And this correlativity of structure and operation in evolution, including human evolution, works in such a way that operations generate structures, which could be thought structures, which in turn give rise to new operations. as long as the trans-individual dimension of being and thinking is not realized or has not been entered into. So what we have is a continuing process of individuation based on structures, on operations generating structures, which again generate new operations. And these transductive operations draw on a set of deep pre-individual potentials that trigger continuing evolution as they foster operations that generate new physical, biological, psychic, and reflexive structures. Importantly, pre-individual potentials can only survive in what Simondon calls metastable fields. A metastable field is a field of unrelieved tension. And in such fields, potentials set forth what he calls structural germs that give rise to operations such as social emotional development or movement and thought that generate new structures and thereby individuate beings' psychic and or reflexive system. So we can look at human psychic and at the human psychic and reflective system as a phase of being, as is true for the physical and the biological system that these systems are embedded in. That means also, as phases of being, they cannot be turned into substances defined by properties. That essentially means one cannot think about them logically, or in other words, logical thinking is incapable of understanding phases of being because it does not understand transduction, nor does it understand metastability, because logical thinking turns a metastable field into a stable field of substances. I will say more about that. And that's exactly the difference between logical and metasystemic thinking. Metasystemic thinking, in my view, is able to keep metastability alive in the mind, in the communication between minds. And that's a situation which collapses if that metastability is approached with purely logical thinking. Let me speak of some ramifications. I'm almost at the end of the notion of transduction, following him, Simondon, closely. To simplify, I would say that the concept of transduction translates into metastability. Transduction can only happen in a metastable field, which translates into energy in the sense of information, which has an emphasis, information has an emphasis on formation or taking form, prendre forme. So it's not the usual positivistic notion of information as a set of data. It's a process. It's an information. And that information is not causal, but I don't need to go into that detail. So in short, transduction is informative in the sense of formative, inducing systemic resonance, which is one of which causality, this is actually not correct. The overriding term in Simondon regarding a system is resonance, and causality is only a subform of resonance, a special form of resonance. And that too is different from people who think logically. So we can say that in this theory, transduction is a liberation of potential energies that adhere metastable fields, feeding on each other in steps of amplification, meaning the cognitive functioning we can see as an amplification of a social emotional functioning. And the social emotional functioning we can see as an amplification of psychological functioning. And as I said, these amplifications are going on as long as there are sufficient potentials in pre-individual reality to carry evolution. So my conclusion at this point, let me see, is there another one? Yes. My conclusion, temporary conclusion, I think, would be that metasystemic cognition, as all cognition, is a transductive process in the following sense. Human movements in thought are operations that produce structures called thought forms. Starting from structural germs that could be logical concepts. And these structures or thought forms give rise to new operations or new movements in thought. For instance, as elements of internal conversation that generate new thought forms. And that's essentially what we do in internal conversations. We're going from one thought form to another. The emphasis here is that we are creating these thought forms. We are not looking them up in a table. That's only, that's an illusion. We are generating them as we think. So in real time, movements in thought in real time, as you know, in CDF are said to follow a point elaborate link sequence or the Pell sequence that activates fields of reflexive energy and creates resonance in a cognitive system. So for instance, if we start with a concept like, or a thought form even, such as unceasing flow, thought form number one, we have the option of elaborating, or a thinker that we listen to has the option of elaborating this thought form. And the concept that the thinker, the interlocutor might have used might be everything is in flow, everything changes rapidly. For us as a listener who is DTF schooled, we see that as unceasing motion, thought form one. As we do this elaboration and linking of thought forms, broadening our mental field, conceptual field, we are creating internally resonating networks of concepts that intrinsically presuppose each other and co-create each other. So we're dealing with a kind of galaxy where we go from one star to the other. And the world changes as we go from one star to the other. Not only our worldview changes, but the world itself changes. I would also say in this context that being transductive, cognitive processes can be called self-scaffolding, which means they are running on their own energy. They don't need to be scaffolded other than by themselves. It's only for beginners that we need to scaffold their self-scaffolding. So in that sense, these cognitive processes that are self-scaffolding, they can't be taught. They can perhaps be modeled, I think, but fundamentally they need to be elicited in oneself and interlocutors so as to generate what Adorno referred to as untrammeled thinking. Untrammeled, unobstructed thinking. Now, how far a transductive cognitive field can remain metastable rather than crashing into logic, rather than stabilizing itself by getting sucked into purely logical concepts, is a function of psychic, epistemic, and social emotional preconditions that need to be fulfilled in both the scaffolder and the scaffoldee, in both parties. I will end with some thoughts on the paucity of metastable fields of communication. My conclusion is that only in a mind that is in a metastable equilibrium, rather than stabilized on account of purely logical thinking, can transductive cognitive processes unfold that create new conceptual structures and networks that resonate dialectically. Sadly to say, there is presently an absence of social supports for creating metastable fields of communication, especially in educational and organizational environments. There's also an absence of knowledge about the interactions between the psychic and the reflexive system of a human being, by which I refer to this relationship, which makes it difficult to harness these interactions as potentials that nurture metasystemic thinking and scaffolding. So there is an absence of certain social realities that would be helpful to have, and there's an absence of certain kinds of knowledge about the psychic and the reflexive system of human beings that would also be helpful and are also missing. My thought is that there are many different ways of bringing an interlocutor's mind into a metastable, non-logical equilibrium, which is a function of utilizing the unrealized potentials available to the human psychic and reflective system in both the scaffolder and the scaffoldee. My facet would be, we are at a point of human cognitive evolution where engaging social, that means trans-individual, collective forces in the enhancement of metastable environments of communication has become an urgent necessity for the sake of human survival in the context of the present global crisis. One warning: whether we become victims of human exceptionalism, meaning that our cognition will save us when counting on the reflexive rather than the psychic system, remains an open question. Maybe the amoeba that has no logical and not any metasystemic thinking will be the survivor, not us. Cognition has been shown to fail in many historical, social circumstances. As you know, history is full of the failures of cognition. That's what I mean by human exceptionalism. So we are sitting between John Gray, who is a pessimist as to human survival, and Steven Pinker, who is an optimist. And we don't know quite where to go. However, we can speak about how we can contribute to creating metastable fields of communication. I think that Habermas was pointing in this direction, but from a very abstract, rationalistic position. But I don't want to go into that. I'm not saying that CDF has any more chances of being helpful.
My question is what I heard, and please correct me if I got it wrong. What I heard is if I would be a beginner, then maybe I would really need another person to kind of start my scaffolding. But once kind of I'm started like an engine, like a system, then maybe I have enough germs within me that I become a system that is kind of self-scaffolding. And from the other side, my question would be, what is it that we can do to support ourselves in self-scaffolding, but also others to kind of start their system so that their self-scaffolding mechanism, engine, organism starts to work?
Yeah, thank you, Bernard. I think these questions would be better addressed in a dialogue between John and me, but I will be glad to also give you input to that. I have, let me emphasize, I have not really given you any practical solutions as to cognitive development, scaffolding it. I have set forth a ontological foundation on which to address those practical questions, since I believe all these practical questions we have and that you just formulated some of have deep theoretical preconditions. And if we don't address these preconditions, we cannot answer the questions, or we can fool us as having answered them. As I said, in this approach, which is a critique of Simondon, but relies on his work. He has been dead since I think 89. I've spoken of the pre-individual potentials that carry planetary being and human being, and thus also our physical system, our biological system, our psychic and reflexive system, which I have introduced as an extension of the psychic system. So these potentials, I have always maintained, theoretically and practically in my teaching, that every human being has a full potential to become a dialectical thinker. Whether he or she will become such a thinker involves many, many factors, more than I can name. But the potential is there. And Elliot Jaques was saying kind of the same thing, and Michael Bassich was saying that. So that I'm not disputing. The question is, what is the nature of these potentials? How do they surface in a psychic system as against reflexive systems? What does it mean for us to say that they surface and show up, empirically speaking? And only when we have answered those questions, that are theoretical questions, can we then begin to address practical questions as to what John has called scaffolding. Scaffolding actually is not maybe the best term, but I've taken it over. I will tell you my reservations regarding the notion of scaffolding. A scaffold is a construction you put around a building to repair it or to build it. And so it's something static that you climb up on and look into the windows of the building you want to investigate. And that's what Heidegger called Fassadenkletterei. You go up a facade, a building. So you don't get into the building. Now, what we want to do in what John called scaffolding is actually getting into the building. And getting into the building, as Edgar Schein always reminds us, has to do with understanding our interlocutor's mental process before we can do anything at all. And how we do that, whether we do that in an orthodox way, in a scientific way, through developmental or cognitive assessment, or informally, if we don't lack the means to do that, we will always, as scaffolders, act from our notion of what is the mental or the reflexive system and the psychic system in the interlocutor that we are dealing with. And we can address that question theoretically and practically and pragmatically, and I guess also politically and socially and so forth. I don't know, I don't think I have answered your question, Bernard. Can you help me by pointing out what was not answered? What element I did not address?
What I find interesting is this idea of kind of kicking off an organism or supporting an organism to spread. So I'm a hobby gardener, and so some things I need to plant, and then I can support their growing, but I cannot make them grow. They
Right.
grow by themselves.
Yes.
But I could kill them, and I could give them not enough water and too much sun, etc. But they need to grow by themselves if they want to grow. And so my question is, how can we be gardeners? And even if we talk about scaffolding, interestingly, my picture was that of ivy or beans growing up a scaffold and not a building being built.
Okay.
So
very good. Yes, thank you. So we all know from our own experience how long it has taken us to get to logical thinking, namely between 10 and 15. And nobody has pushed us to go beyond that. There is no social forcing function to go into metasystemic thinking. But there is, psychologically speaking, external pressure, actual press to speak with the NP system to do so. And that is actually, I think, the psychological root of attempts to develop beyond logical thinking. There must be psychological, or to speak with Simondon, psychic pressures where the psychic system not only needs to extend itself into a reflexive system, embracing social, emotional, and cognitive development, but also to solve its problems and to stay alive and to survive. The human system, the human being must have, or is compelled to evolutionarily advance to a higher level of its functioning. And what Simondon calls that is a trans-individual system, by which he is referring not to society in the sense of Margaret Archer or Berska or Adorno or anybody else. And it's somewhat difficult to explain, but it has to do with collectives, that collectives give rise to trans-individual functioning that is also thinking, where people can think beyond their not only their ego, but their developmental persona. And we don't really know what that looks like. We are hoping that something like that might emerge if we keep scaffolding, or if we run into a real catastrophe that forces us to forget. That will scaffold us. The catastrophe will be the scaffolder. So that's all that comes to mind right now. So we can ask, do we want catastrophe to be our scaffolder, or do we prefer a human collective to do that for us, of which we can become a part? Yes, exactly. That's what I was referring to also by the term of human exceptionalism, meaning that thinking ourselves as Homo sapiens with cognitive capabilities, we may overestimate what even the highest developed thinking can do. So, exactly. So those people, wouldn't you say, are already in a trans-individual reality? Yeah. Thank you. I have written somewhere that one can see, or that I would see, dialectical or metasystemic thinking as an attempt to recapture the infant's embeddedness in the world as a whole, however more differentiated. But I think it's in volume 1, it doesn't matter, that when the child develops language, the whole world breaks down, that it has been part of, according to, I think the author is called Stern, who wrote a wonderful book about that. I forget the first name, but he was saying the development of language brings to an end, you could almost say, a pre-individual reality the infant has been living in, that now is increasingly logified, conceptualized in what we call the school system. And so this notion of the infant that we can only kind of hypothesize because we are not infants anymore, this holistic perception of the world gets lost. And I thought early on that the best notion of dialectical thinking might be that of a way of recapturing that holism, the systemic holism, but in language. And so the question in a way is, can we can we rescue in language what we lost when we began to speak? That would be my question. Yes. That's why for me, it is very important for me, for my interlocutor, whether he's an interviewee or a colleague, to be aware that they are operating in language, that they are speaking at this moment, speaking, tossing around concepts that are substances in a logical fashion, but not aware of the resonance of the network that their concepts are part of. And that's what, for me, scaffolding would be, to open up what seems to be just a concept into a internally resonating network of concepts. that we are led to by thought forms from one to the other. That depends on our notion of scaffolding and of external forces. So I can only think in terms of an example. I think that if I find myself scaffolded, I could experience that as an external pressure. And that would not be helpful to me. Yes. No, not of scaffolding, but of cognition. I spoke of actual press in a neat press system being the predecessor of cognitive functioning. That's what I meant. Yeah.
I think the question is: do we need a catastrophe to develop, or is there something before that?
It's up to us.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's up to us.